Hopefully you had some success on working with the criteria object inside of here. If you didn't, or if you just want to see the solutions, fantastic. Let's figure out how this thing is going to work. Now this criteria object, or this thing that I'm going to pass as some filtering criteria to the find function, I'm going to expect that it's going to take a little bit of logic to form this thing up. So rather than sticking all that logic directly into this function right here, I'm going to make a helper function that I'm going to call build query to build up the actual filter object. So I'm going to call filter query. I'm going to pass in criteria, which is the criteria that we're going to do the search with. Now at the bottom of this file, I will define the build query function. So it will be called with the criteria object, and inside of here, it's going to be up to us to form up an object that will represent the query that we want to, the way in which we want to search our artist collection. Now, the criteria object that's coming inside of here is some like very generic or not very well formed object for searching over our collection, right? And what I mean by that is it has like some random properties on it. Like it has age, which has min and max, which Mongo does not know how to deal with by default, right? It doesn't know what min and max actually means. So we'll be reading from this criteria object, but we're going to make a separate object to return from this function that's going to represent the actual query that we want to send off to Mongo. So that's kind of challenge number one, right? We're not modifying this object in any way. We're just kind of reading some of the desired search results or what the user wants to see from the UI from this object. So instead, I'm going to make an object called query, and we're going to be modifying this object over time to kind of narrow down the query that we're going to be making to our artist collection. So right now, we're going to go through the solution for adding on the idea of querying about the age of artists inside our collection. One thing that I want to remind you really quick is that when we just saw the criteria object console logged out, right? Like when we started actually console logging stuff, and why not? Let's just do that right now really quick. I'm going to add in another console log for criteria. Like so. Now I'm going to expect my code to throw an error, but we should at least see the criteria object get console logged. Okay, so here's our criteria object. Right now it only has a name property on it. So it has no property whatsoever like years active or age, okay, by default when it first starts. When we finally start moving these sliders around, then it gets the age property appended onto it. Or when we move around years active, then it starts getting years active appended onto it. So what the important thing to keep in mind there is that by default, criteria has only a name available on it. So if we want to figure out whether or not we should be updating our query to be considering the different age of an artist, we should put on an if statement that will look at criteria.age. So now we're only going to update our query if the user has modified the age. Then inside of here, we can take our query object and we'll modify it in some fashion to include in this like specific age range that we want to find. So this is where the Mongoose, or the Mongo query operators are going to come to play. And if you recall, I showed you this documentation just a moment ago. So the two operators that we want to be concerned with are likely the greater than or equal to and the less than or equal to operators. So let's see how these are actually going to be used in practice. As a quick reminder, we did already use the in operator, so we kind of saw a little bit about how these things are used, but we didn't specifically use greater than or less than. So let's see how they actually work. To specify that we only want to see artists of an age between some specific values, I'm going to say query.age equals an empty object. This thing is going to have the greater than or equal to operator. I want to see all of the artists with a age greater than or equal to criteria.age.min. Then I also only want to see the artists with an age less than or equal to criteria.age.max. Okay, So remember, the query object that we're forming up right here, we will eventually return it from this function, this build query function. That query object is going to be passed off to the find operation right here. So we are essentially saying, if we took the code that we just wrote and just stuck it in here, I'm going to modify my code really quick. I encourage you to not change your code, but just watch what I'm going to do for a second. We would have the equivalent of age greater than or equal to min age, and I'm going to just abbreviate this thing as min age, and less than or equal to max age. Okay, so that's essentially what we are using this build query function for down here. We're forming up this specific object right here just in a kind of nicely sanctioned off area. All right. So I'm going to go back to just the build query with criteria. Looks good. So my query is looking pretty good so far. At the very bottom, I'm going to return the query that I formed up and then save this file. Now I think that I've got enough stuff for this query that I could actually run it inside of our app. Let's do that right now and see if the age slider works at all. So I'm going to flip over to the app. I'll refresh the page. So by default, my age slider consists of the entire range of all artists inside my database. If I move the slider around, however, like let's say I want to see just artists from 20 to 26, and I submit that, fantastic. Now I only see artists who have an age between 20 and 26. I can move it around a little bit more, and okay, now I see a couple more artists appear on the screen. Notice that I can also sort at the same time that I do my filter. So I'm going from 20 years old all the way up to 30 years old, sorted by age. Awesome, definitely working the way we expect. I like it so far. We're going to take a quick break right now. I'm going to encourage you to give a shot at putting together the years active criteria as well. Okay, so we just put together the filtering for age. I'm going to encourage you to give a shot at years active. In practice, it's going to look very similar, so give it your best shot, and we'll come back in a second and figure it out.